The city kept his secret for 20 years, not because it didn't know, but because it was afraid. On winter nights in South Boston, when the fog rolled off the harbor thick and gray, and the streetlights turned the ice on the sidewalks into something that looked almost beautiful, there was a name that people said quietly, a name you didn't shout, a name you didn't repeat in the wrong company, or on the wrong corner, or to the wrong set of ears. Because somewhere in those shadows, in the back of a liquor store on West Broadway, at a corner table in a Southie tavern, on a cold bench overlooking the dark water at Castle Island, sat a man who the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation had chosen to protect, a man they had decided, in their arrogance and their corruption, was more useful to them alive and free in killing than caged and silent. He was not large, he was not loud, he didn't wear gold chains or drive flashy cars. He walked the streets of his neighborhood like a man who owned them, which, in every way that mattered, he did. Shopkeepers lowered their eyes when he passed. Drug dealers crossed the street. Mothers pointed him out to their children. And those children grew up believing that what they were seeing was a kind of rough justice. A protector, a man of the neighborhood. They were only half wrong. His name, and you may already know it. You may have seen the films, heard the stories. But I promise you tonight that you have never heard it told like this. His name was James Joseph Bulger, Jr. The world called him Whitey. By the end of this story, you will question everything you thought you knew about law, about loyalty, about the American underworld, and about the government that was sworn to protect you. Settle in. This one goes deep. Before we go any further into the darkness of this story, I want to take just a moment to thank you, truly. Out of every story you could have chosen tonight, every podcast, every show, every video, you chose this one. And that means something to me. So I want to ask you something simple. Drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Tell me. I read every single one. And if this is the kind of story that keeps you company through the long quiet hours of the night, please give it a like. Hit subscribe and share it with someone who loves true crime. Someone who appreciates a story told slowly with the weight it deserves. Now get comfortable. Pull that blanket up. Dim the lights if you haven't already, because we are going all the way back to the beginning. Back to a housing project in South Boston in the year 1938, where a little boy with white blonde hair was already watching the world with eyes that missed nothing. Now let's go back to the beginning. To understand Whitey Bulger, you first have to understand South Boston. And to understand South Boston, you have to forget everything that city looks like today. Forget the gentrified coffee shops and the converted loft apartments and the young professionals with their strollers and their craft beers. The South Boston of the 1930s and 1940s was something altogether different. It was a world unto itself, an island of working-class Irish Catholic America, planted in the middle of a city that had never fully welcomed the Irish to begin with. The Irish had come to Boston in waves, driven out of their own country by famine, by poverty, by British rule, and they had arrived in a city that greeted them with signs that read, "No Irish need apply." They settled in the cheapest, most crowded neighborhoods. They worked the docks. They hauled coal and laid railroad tracks and dug the sewers of the city that looked down on them even as they built it. And over decades, they carved out something fiercely their own. South Boston, Southie, to everyone who lived there, became a fortress. A tight, proud, suspicious, deeply loyal community where outsiders were watched with cold eyes and neighbors were protected like family. The streets smelled of salt water and coal smoke and the particular damp cold of a Boston winter that gets into your coat and your bones and stays there until June. The harbor was close, always close. You could hear the foghorns at night. Children played in narrow alleyways between three-decker houses. Women hung washing on lines strung between buildings. Men came home from the docks with calloused hands and tired eyes, and they stopped at the tavern on the corner before they came all the way home. Because the tavern was the one place where the weight of the day could be set down for an hour. The Catholic Church sat at the center of everything. The priests knew everyone's name. The nuns ran the schools with iron discipline. Sunday Mass was not optional. It was the thread that held the fabric of the neighborhood together. You were Irish, you were Catholic, you were from Southie. These three things were not merely identity. They were a declaration of survival. James Joseph Bulger Sr. had come from Harbor Grace, Newfoundland, the son of Irish immigrants who had never quite found their footing in the New World. He settled in Everett, Massachusetts, and married a first-generation Irish immigrant named Jane Veronica McCarthy, a woman everyone called Jean. They started a family with the particular hopefulness of people who have never had very much but believe. With the stubbornness of the Irish, that things will eventually get better. They had 6 children. James Jr. was the second. Born on September 3, 1929, in Dorchester, he was a healthy, blonde-haired baby with pale eyes that seemed to be taking stock of everything even before he could speak. For a few years, things were manageable. James Sr. worked as a union laborer, an occasional longshoreman. It was hard work, but honest work. And then the accident happened. James Sr. lost his arm. The details of the industrial accident that took his arm are not recorded with great precision. What is recorded is the effect. With one arm gone, James Sr. could no longer work the docks. The wages stopped. The family, which had been barely scraping by, slid all the way down into genuine poverty. And in May of 1938, Jimmy was 8 years old. The Bulger family moved into the Mary Ellen McCormick housing project in South Boston. It was one of the first public housing projects in America. The buildings were solid, clean brick structures, and compared to the crumbling tenements many Southie families occupied, they were actually considered a step up. The project had grass between the buildings, a rare thing in the neighborhood. It had a sense of order to it, a kind of managed poverty that the city felt good about providing, but it was still a housing project. And in Southie, in the late 1930s, the project was where you ended up when everything else had already gone wrong. James Sr., a proud man with one arm and a family of 6 children, did the best he could. He took whatever odd jobs were available. Jean kept the household running with the particular ferocious competence of Irish Catholic mothers of that era, women who somehow managed to feed, clothe, and raise large families on almost nothing, and who did it without complaint, because complaining was not something you did. You endured, you prayed, you kept going. The children grew up in the project, in the streets, in the orbit of the Catholic Church and the local school, and they grew up very differently from one another. William, Billy, the younger brother, was a serious, studious, brilliant boy. He would go on to become one of the most powerful politicians in Massachusetts history, serving in the state legislature for decades and eventually becoming president of the Massachusetts Senate. He would become president of the University of Massachusetts. Billy Bulger was, by every measure, a success story. The immigrant's dream made real. The project kid who studied his way out and into the corridors of legitimate power. Jimmy took a different path from very early. Jimmy Bulger had a restlessness in him that school could not contain and church could not redirect. He was sharp. Everyone who knew him agreed on that. He was observant in a way that was unusual in a child. He watched adults. He noticed what people wanted, what they feared, what they were hiding. He had the particular intelligence of someone who has decided, very young, that the official rules of the world do not apply to them. He tried to run away to join the circus at age 10. That story has been told with a kind of fond amusement over the years. Jimmy the Wild Child, the adventurous one, but there's something in it worth sitting with. At 10 years old, this child looked at the life in front of him, the project, the poverty, the diminished father, the careful mother, the grinding ordinary difficulty of Southie, and he thought, there must be something else. There must be something more. He was right. There was something more. He just went looking for it in the wrong direction. By the time he was 14, Jimmy Bulger had been arrested for larceny. His first arrest, not his last. The local police had already given him a nickname, Whitey, because of that white blonde hair. A name he reportedly hated, a name he preferred not to use, though it would follow him for the rest of his life. He joined a street gang called the Shamrocks. He fought, he stole. He was sent to a juvenile reformatory, where the system attempted to correct him with the tools available in the 1940s. Discipline, structure, religious instruction. None of it took. The streets of Southie had already given him a different kind of education, and that education was more powerful than anything a reformatory could offer. In the streets of South Boston, the real lessons were simple. Loyalty was everything. Violence was a language everyone understood. Power came to the man who was willing to do what others were afraid to do. And the official world, the police, the courts, the government, was not your friend. It was something you navigated, something you outwitted, something you used when you could and avoided when you couldn't. Jimmy Bulger learned these lessons completely. He was, perhaps, the most gifted student the streets of Southie ever produced. He carried himself differently from other boys his age. There was a stillness to him, even in the middle of chaos. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't bluster. He watched and he waited, and when he moved with purpose. People who knew him as a young man described something in his pale eyes that was difficult to name, not anger. Exactly. More like calculation. More like the look of someone who is always thinking several moves ahead. He was 16 when he had his first serious run-in with violence. 17 when he committed his first armed robbery. He was building a reputation, block by block. The way a man lays bricks, slowly, deliberately. Each one placed exactly where he intended. South Boston had made him. The poverty and the pride and the insularity and the violence, all of it, had poured into this particular vessel and produced something dangerous and brilliant and utterly without remorse. The world would spend the next 70 years learning that lesson. By the time Jimmy Bulger was in his mid-teens, the streets of South Boston had become his classroom, his gymnasium, and his church, his first arrest. At 14, for larceny, barely registered. In Southie in the 1940s, a 14-year-old boy caught stealing was not a catastrophe. It was almost a rite of passage. The reformatory he was sent to, the kind of institution that the era believed could straighten out troubled youth through routine and discipline, merely delayed him. It did not change him. What it did, if anything, was confirm something he had already suspected, that the system could take you, hold you, process you, and spit you back out, and that a smart man could survive all of it and come back stronger. The reformatory taught him patience. It taught him how to read a room full of men who were all, in their various ways, dangerous. It taught him how to be still. He returned to Southie and immediately continued his criminal education throughout his late teens. Bulger was in and out of local police custody for a rotating series of charges: assault and battery, theft, forgery, fighting. He was part of a gang culture that was the street-level reality of Southie, where boys grew up fast and men settled their disputes with their hands or worse. Violence in this world was not extraordinary. It was the currency of respect. The man who backed down was the man who was next to get robbed or taxed or beaten. The man who stood his ground, who went further than anyone expected, was the man who climbed. Jimmy Bulger went further than anyone expected, every single time. The violence he engaged in, even as a young man, was never random. That is the detail that separated him from the ordinary street thugs of his era. He was not someone who fought in a fury and regretted it later. He was someone who decided a thing, planned it carefully, executed it, and felt nothing afterward that he needed to explain or justify. People who committed violence out of emotion made mistakes, left evidence, talked too much afterward. Jimmy made no such mistakes. He committed armed robbery in his late teens with a methodical efficiency that alarmed even the men around him. He cased places. He thought about exits. He thought about witnesses. He thought about what could go wrong and prepared for it. For a boy who had never been trained in anything, never had a mentor, never received any formal instruction in the art of crime, it was remarkable, as if he had been born knowing how. In 1948, he did something that surprised everyone who knew him. He joined the United States Air Force. There has been some speculation about why. Maybe it was pressure from family. Maybe it was the law breathing down his neck in a way that made military service seem preferable to another stretch in custody. Maybe on some level, there was still a part of Jimmy Bulger that believed he could redirect his restlessness into something that wore a uniform and gave orders. Maybe he genuinely thought he could be contained. He could not. His time in the Air Force was marked by insubordination, disappearances, and a general contempt for authority that the military found deeply unwelcome. He went AWOL absent without leave. More than once, he was arrested on Air Force bases. He was disciplined. He was disciplined again. The Air Force is an institution built on the premise that every individual is a replaceable part of a larger machine, and that the machine's needs take absolute precedence over the individual's preferences. For a man who had spent his entire life operating by the opposite principle, that he was the only authority worth obeying, the Air Force was simply unworkable. He received his discharge in 1952. The exact nature of the discharge has been described variously over the years. But what is certain is that the United States military was not sorry to see him go. And Jimmy Bulger walked back into civilian life in Massachusetts with no particular plan, no particular prospects, and no particular concern about either. He was 23 years old. He had learned, if nothing else, that institutions, the reformatory, the Air Force, any institution you cared to name, were not capable of holding him. He had moved through them like water through cupped hands. They had tried to shape him, and they had failed. Back in Massachusetts, the arrests continued. For the next several years, he accumulated a record that most prosecutors would have found discouraging to prosecute. Because Jimmy Bulger was developing a talent for making cases difficult, witnesses developed memory problems. Evidence had a way of becoming complicated. He understood, instinctively, how the machinery of criminal justice worked. And he understood that the machinery could be frustrated, but he was also escalating. The street-level theft and fighting of his teens had given way to something more serious by his mid-20s. Jimmy Bulger was committing bank robberies, not the panicked, desperate bank robberies of a man who needs money. Planned, coordinated, professional bank robberies across multiple states, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Indiana, Florida. He was mobile. He thought geographically. He understood that crossing state lines complicated federal jurisdiction in ways that local authorities weren't always equipped to navigate. He was wrong about that last part, as it turned out. But before the federal law caught up with him, Jimmy Bulger spent several years as one of the more capable armed robbers in the Northeast, a fact that would have impressed the people of South Boston had they known the full extent of it, and terrified them had they known what was coming next. In 1956, the federal law finally caught up with James Joseph Bulger Jr. He was 26 years old. He was charged with bank robbery and truck hijacking across 4 states, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Indiana, and Florida. The evidence was substantial. The federal prosecutors were competent, and in a federal courtroom, without the local complications that had frustrated previous prosecutions. Jimmy Bulger was convicted. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. 20 years. Most men, hearing that sentence, would experience a kind of collapse. 20 years is not merely time taken away. It is the theft of your youth, your prime, your possibilities. It is the destruction of everything you might have built in those years. Relationships, family, a life. For most men, 20 years in a federal penitentiary is a kind of death. For Jimmy Bulger, it was school. He was sent first to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Atlanta in the late 1950s was a serious institution, not the worst in the federal system, but far from comfortable. It housed hard men, murderers, organized crime figures, men who had done things that could not be unsaid or undone. The population was a graduate seminar in American criminality, and Jimmy Bulger was one of the most attentive students in the room. He watched, he listened, he read. He had always been a reader, another quality that surprised people who expected the street thug to be illiterate. He consumed history, biography, strategy. He was interested in power, not the raw street corner power of someone who can punch harder than the next man, but the deeper, more durable power of someone who understands systems and can make those systems work for him. In Atlanta, something else happened that would become one of the stranger footnotes in his long, strange story. The CIA was running a program, Project MKUltra. You may have heard of it. Officially sanctioned by the United States government, operated out of universities, hospitals, and prisons from the early 1950s until the late 1960s. The stated goal was the development of mind control techniques, ostensibly as a Cold War weapon against the Soviet Union. The actual practice involved administering hallucinogenic drugs, primarily LSD, but also mescaline and other compounds, to unwitting or coerced subjects, recording the results and calling it science in Atlanta. The program was recruiting prison volunteers. The pitch was straightforward. Participate in the experiments, and your sentence might be reduced. Jimmy Bulger, 26 years old and facing 20 years, volunteered. For months, he was administered LSD under clinical conditions. He described the experiences later as deeply disturbing, hallucinatory, disorienting, terrifying in ways that were difficult to articulate. He wrote about it in letters. He talked about it to associates for the rest of his life. The insomnia and nightmares that plagued him in his later years were something he attributed, at least in part, to those experiments. What he didn't know at the time, what none of the prison volunteers knew, was that they were not being studied for their own benefit or for some legitimate psychiatric purpose. They were human test subjects in a covert government program that treated them as expendable raw material. When Bulger eventually learned the truth about MKUltra, that the government had deliberately deceived and exploited him, it produced in him a rage that his associates described as something cold and permanent. Not hot rage, not explosive rage, the kind of rage that settles in like a stone at the bottom of a river and stays there. Invisible, immovable, according to his longtime associate Kevin Weeks. Bulger was so enraged that he made serious inquiries about tracking down and killing the doctor who had administered the drugs to him. Whether he acted on this impulse is not definitively established. What is established is that the MKUltra experience confirmed for Jimmy Bulger something he had suspected since childhood, that the government, the official world, the institutions that claimed authority over citizens, they were not trustworthy. They were not moral. They were not above using the people they claimed to protect as tools and then discarding them. This was not a lesson that made him sympathetic or sorrowful. It made him strategic. If the government was willing to do this, if the FBI, the CIA, the entire apparatus of federal power was willing to drug prisoners in their care, for secret experiments. Then there was no moral high ground. There was only power, and the question of who held it, and whether you could take it from them or make them serve you. From Atlanta, Bulger was transferred to what was, in 1959, the most famous and feared prison in America, Alcatraz. The name alone carried a weight that was almost mythological. The Rock, the island prison in San Francisco Bay, 2 miles from shore, surrounded by water so cold and currents, so treacherous that the idea of swimming to freedom was considered nearly suicidal. 21-acre island built on solid rock. The prison rising from it like a fortress. At night, you could hear the foghorn. You could hear the distant sounds of San Francisco, music, sometimes. On certain nights, when the wind was right, a city full of light and life and freedom, sitting just close enough to torment you. The population of Alcatraz was the federal system's most difficult prisoners. Men who had caused problems at other institutions. Men considered escape risks. Men whose crimes were so serious, or whose behavior so disruptive, that the system wanted them on an island where there was nowhere to go. Jimmy Bulger arrived at Alcatraz in 1959. He was 30 years old. He would later describe his time on the Rock with a certain detached composure that impressed the men around him, where other prisoners were broken by the isolation, and many were, in ways that were difficult to look at. Bulger used the isolation. He was calm. He was controlled. He observed his fellow prisoners the way a naturalist observes animals, cataloging their weaknesses, their strengths, their tendencies, what made them dangerous and what made them vulnerable. He studied. He exercised. He kept his head down in the ways that mattered, not as submission, but as patience. He understood that this place was temporary, that the sentence had an end, that every day was a day closer to walking back out into the world, and that the man who walked out needed to be more dangerous, more prepared, more capable than the boy who had walked in. Alcatraz closed in 1963. Budget constraints, deteriorating buildings, the impracticality of supplying an island prison. The federal government decided it was no longer worth maintaining. The prisoners were transferred to other institutions. Jimmy Bulger was moved back through the federal system, and in 1965, after 9 years of the 20-year sentence, he was paroled. 9 years, not 20. The LSD experiments had contributed to the sentence reduction. As promised, the cruel irony of that, the government experimenting on him, reducing his sentence as payment, sending him back out into the world, would not have been lost on him. He was 35 years old. He had spent 9 years studying violence, power, organization, and human weakness. He had survived Atlanta and Alcatraz. He had survived the CIA's experiments on his mind. He had watched men break, and he had not broken. He walked out of federal prison in 1965, a completely different creature from the bank robber who had walked in. The street kid from Southie was gone. In his place was something quieter, colder, and vastly more capable. South Boston had no idea what was coming home. He came home in the winter. Boston in January is a city stripped down to its bones, the trees bare, the harbor dark and choppy, the streets swept clean by a wind that comes straight off the Atlantic without apology. Jimmy Bulger walked back into South Boston on a winter day in 1965, and Southie received him not as a convicted federal criminal, but as something closer to a returning warrior. This is important to understand. In the world of Southie, going to prison, even federal prison, carried a different moral weight than it did in the polite suburbs of Newton or Wellesley. Prison meant you had been taken on by the system and had survived it. It meant you were tough enough to do time. It meant you had not broken, not informed, not cooperated. In a community built on distrust of authority, a man who had done 9 years without cooperating with the government had demonstrated the most important virtue the neighborhood recognized: Jimmy Bulger was not disgraced by his conviction. He was, in the complicated moral mathematics of Southie, respected for it. He was 35 years old, lean and sharp-eyed, with the particular composure of a man who has been tested and passed. He moved back into the neighborhood and immediately began making connections, assessing the landscape, understanding who held power and how securely they held it. The criminal landscape of South Boston in 1965 was dominated by a gang run by a man named Donald Killeen. The Killeens, Donnie, Kenny, and Eddie, three brothers, had controlled Southie's rackets for over 2 decades. Gambling, loan sharking, extortion, the ordinary infrastructure of neighborhood organized crime. Their base of operations was the Transit Cafe on West Broadway, a bar that functioned as the unofficial courthouse of Southie's underworld. The Killeens were powerful, established, and reasonably competent, but they were also complacent in the way that people become when they have gone unchallenged for long enough. Bulger went to work for them as an enforcer and bookmaker. He was good at it. He was better than good within a short time. The Killeens understood that what they had hired was not an ordinary soldier. Jimmy Bulger was something different, a man with the intelligence and the patience and the willingness to do whatever was necessary that separated ordinary criminals from the men who actually ran things. But then the gang war started. In 1971, Kenny Killeen, the youngest of the brothers, allegedly shot and seriously wounded Mickey Dwyer, a member of a rival gang called the Mullins, during a brawl at the Transit Cafe. The Mullen gang had been growing younger, hungrier, more aggressive than the established Killeen operation, and they were not inclined to absorb this attack quietly. What followed was a gang war that ran through the streets of South Boston like a fever. Men were shot, men disappeared. The Killeens found themselves, to their surprise and alarm, outgunned and outmaneuvered by the younger Mullins. The dynamic of the neighborhood was shifting in ways that the Killeen brothers, comfortable in their long dominance, had not anticipated and were not prepared to handle. Jimmy Bulger watched. He was working for the Killeens. He had their trust. He had their information. He had their confidence. And he made a calculation that only a certain kind of man is capable of making. The kind that has studied power long enough to understand that loyalty is a tool, not a principle, and that the only question worth asking is which side is going to win. The answer was becoming clear. The Mullins were going to win. Bulger reached out to Howie Winter, Howard T. Winter was the boss of the Winter Hill Gang, a predominantly Irish-American crime organization based in Somerville, Massachusetts, a city just northwest of Boston. The Winter Hill Gang was more sophisticated, more organized, and more dangerous than either the Killeens or the Mullins. Howie Winter was a pragmatist. He wanted South Boston's rackets, and he understood that the gang war happening there represented an opportunity. The deal Bulger made with Winter was elegant in its treachery. He would deliver South Boston. He would help end the gang war by, essentially, ensuring that his employers, the Killeens, lost it. In exchange, he would become Winter Hill's man in Southie, with all the protection and authority that entailed. The Killeens were finished. Their leadership was decimated. Some accounts suggest Bulger committed his first murder during this period. A Mullen gang member named Paul McGonigal. Shot in the head, the gang war wound down, and when the smoke cleared, Jimmy Bulger was standing, not as a subordinate, not as a soldier, but as the uncontested boss of South Boston's criminal world, operating under the umbrella of the Winter Hill Gang. He was 41 years old. It had taken him 6 years. The chess move that made it possible was not brute force. It was strategic betrayal, the willingness to calculate coldly when every instinct and every code of the neighborhood said that loyalty was sacred. He understood, in a way that the Killeens never did, that codes were for men who needed them. Men who had real power made their own codes. He set up operations. He built his organization with the same methodical patience he had used to survive Alcatraz. He recruited carefully. He tested people. He watched for weaknesses, for men who drank too much, who talked too much, who owed money, who had secrets. He built, piece by piece, an organization that ran on fear and competence in equal measure. And he began to think about the one remaining vulnerability: the law. He had survived federal prison once. He had no intention of surviving it again. He needed protection, real protection, not the ordinary arrangement of paid-off cops and cooperative politicians that most organized crime figures relied on. He needed something more fundamental. He needed to be, in some essential way, untouchable. In 1975, he found it. John Joseph Connolly, Jr. grew up in the Old Harbor Housing Project in South Boston, the same project where the Bulger family had lived. As a boy, Connolly had idolized Jimmy Bulger. This is documented not as speculation, but as established fact, confirmed by Connolly himself. In the hierarchy of the housing project, the Bulger boys occupied a particular status, and Jimmy, older, tougher, more magnetic than the other boys, was someone Connolly had watched and admired from a distance. There was a story Connolly told in later years, before everything collapsed, about how Jimmy Bulger had once given him some money when he was a kid, a small act of kindness that Connolly had apparently never forgotten. John Connolly grew up, went to college, joined the FBI. He became a special agent. He was assigned to the Boston field office, the same city where he had grown up, the same neighborhood where he had been formed, the same streets where his loyalties had been set in the bedrock of his youth. He was, in theory, a law enforcement officer of the United States government. In practice, he had never left South Boston. In 1975, Connolly approached Bulger with a proposition: the FBI, as part of its ongoing effort to dismantle the New England Mafia, the Patriarca crime family, based in Providence, Rhode Island, was looking to develop high-level informants inside Boston's criminal world. The Patriarca family had deep roots in the city. FBI agents believed that taking them down would represent a significant blow to organized crime in the region. Bulger was the obvious candidate. He had connections, he had information, and he had a rival. The Italian mob competed directly with the Winter Hill Gang for Boston's rackets, an arrangement that gave him FBI protection while he used bureau resources against his Italian competitors was, from a purely strategic standpoint, too good to pass up. They met at night in Connolly's car. Parked at Wollaston Beach, Connolly, according to his own later accounts, told Bulger that the FBI could help him in his ongoing conflict with the Patriarca family, that they could share information, that they could, in the delicate language of the Bureau, make certain situations more manageable. Bulger agreed. What happened next was not a law enforcement relationship. It was not even an arrangement that resembled what the FBI's formal protocols described as a top echelon informant relationship. What it was, from the very beginning, was a corruption so deep and so complete that it would eventually be described by federal investigators as the worst informant scandal in the history of the Bureau. Bulger gave the FBI just enough to justify keeping him active, enough to take down Patriarca family members, competitors who Bulger wanted removed anyway, enough to allow agents like Connolly to point to their record of Mafia prosecutions and call themselves successful. The FBI believed it was running Bulger. In reality, Bulger was running the FBI. In exchange for this carefully rationed trickle of information, Connolly provided Bulger with intelligence that was worth infinitely more. He told Bulger, who was talking to the government. He warned him when grand jury investigations were being convened. He identified other informants, men inside Bulger's own organization, or men on the periphery who had decided to cooperate with federal prosecutors, and gave Bulger their names. Those men died, every single one. The arrangement went deeper than Connolly alone. His supervisor, a man named John Morris, became corrupted. Morris received money from Bulger, cash payments, gifts, wine, favors. He accepted Bulger's hospitality and in exchange looked away from things he was paid to investigate. He allowed the relationship between his agent and his informant to fester and grow without oversight or accountability. And it grew. The Boston FBI field office, over the years that followed, became something that would have been unthinkable to any citizen who believed in the institutions their government had built. It became, in the relevant portion of its operations, a tool of the very criminal it was supposed to be investigating. Agents who raised concerns were managed. Cases that pointed in the wrong direction were quietly redirected. When other law enforcement agencies, the Massachusetts State Police, the Boston Police Department, began building cases against Bulger, they found their investigations frustrated in ways they couldn't always explain. Files that should have led somewhere led nowhere. Sources dried up. Investigations stalled. It was not bad luck. It was John Connolly. The FBI's own rules required regular reviews of informants, required documentation, required supervisory oversight. None of it worked as intended because the men who were supposed to enforce the rules were the men who had been corrupted by the arrangement. Bulger, for his part, played the relationship with the same cold intelligence he brought to everything. He understood what Connolly needed: recognition, status, the feeling that he was running something important. Connolly wanted to be the man who had cultivated the most valuable informant in the Bureau's history. He wanted the credit and the career advancement that came with it. Bulger gave him exactly what he needed to believe. He also paid him, over the years. Bulger paid Connolly more than $235,000 in cash. Gifts and other benefits he paid Morris. He maintained the payments with the same regularity and care that any businessman maintains contracts with essential partners. Because that is what this was, a business arrangement. Bulger was paying for a service immunity, and he was receiving that service in full. He used the relationship in every direction. When a rival was becoming a problem, Connolly could sometimes tell him whether that rival was talking to the government, making the decision about what to do much simpler. When a law enforcement operation was closing in, Connolly could provide enough advance warning to allow adjustments. When Bulger identified someone in the Patriarcha family who he wanted the FBI to focus on, he could direct that attention through Connolly. The Italian Mafia in Boston had no idea why the FBI seemed so relentlessly focused on them, why their communications were being monitored and their members prosecuted, why their organization seemed to be deteriorating in ways that were difficult to explain. They didn't know that the man the FBI claimed as its most valuable source was feeding the Bureau just enough information to keep his enemies busy while he consolidated power in ways that made him, effectively, untouchable. There was a moment in the late 1970s that captures the whole obscenity of the arrangement in a single fact. In 1979, the Winter Hill Gang, Bulger's gang, was indicted on charges of fixing horse races. Howie Winter, the gang's nominal boss, was convicted and sent to prison. Several others went down with him. Jimmy Bulger was not indicted. The reason, as investigators would later establish, was that John Connolly had intervened to protect his informant. He had made sure that Bulger's name did not appear in the indictment. He had ensured that the one man most central to the Winter Hill gang's operations was somehow absent from the charges against it. When Winter went to prison, Bulger stepped into the void. He became the boss of the Winter Hill Gang. He had eliminated his rivals, protected himself from prosecution, and ascended to the top of Boston's criminal world. And he had done it with the active assistance of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The ground was shifting, and not one person outside a small circle of corrupt agents and terrified associates understood what was happening underneath their feet. By the early 1980s, Jimmy Bulger was the most powerful criminal in Boston. Not the most famous. He worked hard to avoid fame. Not the most feared in any dramatic, cinematic sense, but the most powerful in the way that real power works, quietly, comprehensively, with tentacles in every direction, and the machinery of the FBI running cover. His partner in the day-to-day management of the empire was Stephen Flemmi. Stephen, the rifleman Flemmi, was a lean, cold-eyed man with a talent for violence that was, if anything, even more clinical than Bulger's own. He had been an FBI informant since 1965, even before Bulger, recruited by an agent who had seen in him the same usefulness that Connolly would later see in Bulger. Flemmi had grown up in Roxbury, not Southie, and his background was different. Where Bulger was the Irish product of the housing project, Flemmi was the son of Italian immigrants who had grown up in a mixed neighborhood and carried a different kind of edge. Together, Bulger and Flemmi were the Winter Hill Gang's operational center. Their partnership was not warm. There was no warmth in either of them. Not in the way the word is commonly meant, but it was effective. They thought similarly, valued similar things, and understood the terms of their arrangement with the FBI in similar ways. Their empire was vast by the standards of local organized crime. Drug dealing was the most lucrative piece of it, though Bulger maintained, publicly and loudly, that he opposed drugs in South Boston. This was one of the great hypocrisies of his career, and it is worth lingering on, because it tells you something essential about the man. In public, on the streets, in the conversations he had with neighbors, in the persona he carefully maintained, Jimmy Bulger was the man who kept drugs out of Southie. He was known to confront dealers, to warn them away from the neighborhood, to make it clear that anyone selling heroin to the children of South Boston would answer to him. Parents believed this. Community leaders believed it. The mythology of Whitey Bulger as a neighborhood protector was built substantially on this claim. The reality, documented in court testimony and surveillance and the eventual cooperation of associates, was that Bulger ran one of the largest drug distribution operations in the region. He controlled 3 separate drug distribution networks operating out of South Boston. He didn't sell the drugs himself. He taxed the men who did. He demanded a percentage of every transaction, a protection fee, a tribute. If you wanted to deal drugs in his territory, you paid Jimmy Bulger, and if you didn't pay, or if you tried to operate without his permission, the consequences were immediate and severe. By the time the D caught up to his drug operation in the late 1980s, investigators estimated that Bulger had earned approximately $30 million from the drug trade. $30 million from the neighborhood he publicly claimed to be protecting from exactly that trade. The extortion operation was equally comprehensive. Every bookie in South Boston paid Bulger, every loan shark, every business owner on the wrong block who wanted to remain in business without incident. The numbers were not negotiable. You paid what you were told, when you were told, without complaint. The men who collected the payments were polite, businesslike. There was rarely a need for explicit threats. The implicit understanding of what happened to people who refused was sufficient. He controlled portions of the waterfront, the docks, the Teamsters connections, the supply lines of commerce moving in and out of Boston Harbor. He had relationships with legitimate businesses that served as both cover for his activities and vehicles for laundering the money those activities generated. The back room of a liquor store on West Broadway became one of his primary operational centers, a place where men came to report, to receive instructions, to settle accounts. Kevin Weeks was the man Bulger trusted most in this period. Weeks was 27 years younger than Bulger, young enough to be his son, and he had the particular devotion of someone who has given himself over completely to another man's authority. He was Bulger's eyes and ears in the neighborhood, his enforcer, his most trusted lieutenant. He would later cooperate with federal investigators, and his testimony would ultimately help convict the man he had served. Bulger also, during this period, became involved in something that would contribute to his peculiar status as a figure of geopolitical consequence. He supplied weapons to the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, fighting the British government's presence in Northern Ireland in a conflict that had been going on for decades. Needed weapons, and they needed money to buy them. Irish-American communities in cities like Boston and New York had been sources of both for years, fueled by immigrant sympathy for the cause and a hatred of the British that ran deep in the Irish Catholic culture of neighborhoods like Southie. Bulger's operations facilitated the movement of weapons to Ireland, a fact that gave him, in certain circles, a kind of romantic nationalist credibility that sat very oddly alongside the reality of what he was doing to the community he claimed to represent. His personal life during this period was complicated. He had a long relationship with a woman named Teresa Stanley, a divorcee from Southie with several children. He was a presence in her children's lives, playing a version of the role of father while being in every other respect of his existence, something entirely different from any ordinary family man. He also had a relationship with a woman named Catherine Grieg, younger than Stanley, devoted in a way that was total and absolute, a woman who would eventually make the choice to give up her entire life, her family, her freedom, and her identity to follow him into the darkness of a 16-year fugitive existence. What she saw in him, or what he provided for her, is something that resists easy explanation. But the devotion was real. The choice she made was real. And its consequences for her were real. There was also loss. In 1973, Bulger's son Douglas, a young man born of an earlier relationship, died in a dune buggy accident. He was in his early 20s. This was, by most accounts, one of the few times in his adult life that something cracked through Jimmy Bulger's extraordinary self-control. The associates who were around him during that period described a grief that was genuine and raw in a way that nothing else in his life seemed to be. He did not have the language for it. He did not know how to carry it. He put it away, eventually, the way he put everything away, with a quiet deliberation that looked, from the outside, like recovery, but was probably something else entirely. The neighborhood, meanwhile, continued to regard him with a complicated mixture of fear and affection that was, in its own way, one of the stranger social phenomena of 20th century American urban life. At Thanksgiving, his men distributed turkeys to families in the project. At Christmas, there were gestures of generosity, money to people who needed it, problems fixed, situations handled. He was known to confront men who were mistreating their wives or their children. He was known to give money to local youth sports programs. He attended funerals. He shook hands. He remembered names. He was, to the people of South Boston who never looked too closely or asked too many questions, a kind of rough guardian of the neighborhood. They did not know about the $30 million from drugs. They did not know about the murders. They did not know that the man handing out turkeys on Thanksgiving was the same man who had strangled women and buried them in the basements of buildings a few blocks away. Some of them suspected and chose not to know that, too. Tells you something about South Boston and about how power works in communities that have learned, over generations of marginalization, to resolve their own problems outside the official channels of a system they do not trust. There are 19 names, 19 people who are dead because of James Bulger. The federal jury convicted him of 11. Prosecutors charged 19. And investigators who have spent decades examining his career believe the actual number may be higher. I want to say their names. I want to give them a moment, each of them, because in the story of Whitey Bulger, they are too often reduced to footnotes, data points in a narrative about a gangster. when they were, first and before everything else, human beings with lives and families and people who loved them. Let me take you through the ones we know most about. Paul McGonigal, a member of the Mullen Gang, shot in the early 1970s during the gang war that gave Bulger his power. He was the first, or among the first, a man killed not for any particular crime against Bulger, but because he was on the wrong side of a strategic calculation. His murder was, by Bulger's own oblique later admissions, the act that proved to the Winter Hill Gang that their new Southie ally was serious. Paul McGonigal was a proof of concept. Edward Connors, 1975. A man who had the misfortune of witnessing something he should not have witnessed. He was identified as a potential problem, a person who knew too much and might, eventually, decide to share what he knew with the wrong people. He was shot. He was silenced. This was the calculus that governed dozens of decisions in Bulger's world. Information was dangerous, and the people who carried dangerous information needed to be removed. Thomas King, 1975. A rival gangster, shot in the back of the head. His body was buried under the Neponset River Bridge in Quincy, one of several locations where Bulger and his associates hid what they had done. The bridge, the basement, the hillside. There were bodies all over greater Boston, in places where no one looked, waiting to be found. Richard Costucci, 1976, a nightclub owner who Bulger believed was passing information to the government. The intelligence, in this case, came from John Connolly, the FBI's own files, weaponized against a man who had tried to cooperate with law enforcement. Costucci died because he trusted the FBI, John Martirano, the Winter Hill Gang's designated hitman, a meticulous, methodical killer who would eventually confess to more than 20 murders, was sent to handle it. And then we come to Roger Wheeler. Roger Wheeler was not from Boston. He was not from the world of South Boston gangsters and corrupt FBI agents. He was a 61-year-old businessman from Tulsa, Oklahoma. He had made a fortune in the technology sector. He owned Telex Corporation, one of the early computer technology companies. He played golf. He had a family. He lived the comfortable life of a successful American businessman. He had also purchased the company that owned World Jai Alai, a chain of sports betting operations in several states, including Florida and Connecticut. This is where Roger Wheeler's path crossed Whitey Bulger's. The Winter Hill Gang had been skimming money from World Jai Alai's operations for years through John Callahan, a former president of the company who maintained connections to the gang. Wheeler, being a careful businessman, eventually noticed that the numbers didn't add up. He began asking questions. He brought in investigators. He was getting close to the truth. And so, on May 27, 1981, at the Southern Hills Country Club in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as Roger Wheeler finished a round of golf and walked to his car, a man wearing a false mustache and a disguise walked up to him in the parking lot. The man's name was John Martirano. He was following instructions from Bulger and Flemmi. He shot Roger Wheeler in the face at close range, between the eyes. Roger Wheeler died in the parking lot of his country club. He was 55 years old. He had a wife. He had children. He had nothing to do with South Boston, or the FBI, or any of it. He was killed because he was a careful businessman who noticed a discrepancy in his accounts. After the murder, there was a problem. Brian Halloran knew. Brian Halloran, 42 years old, known in the neighborhood as Balloon Head, a nickname that captured something of both his personality and his cocaine habit. He was a career criminal, a drug dealer, a man who had done violent things in his own right. He had been at a dinner in Miami where Bulger and Callahan had discussed the Wheeler murder, and he knew what he had heard. Halloran decided to cooperate with the FBI. He approached agents and offered information about the Wheeler killing, about Bulger, about all of it. He was willing to wear a wire. He wanted protection for himself and his family. What Halloran did not know, could not have known, was that his approach to the FBI was reported directly back to Bulger. John Connolly, faithful and corrupt to the end, told his informant that Halloran was talking. He told Bulger exactly what Halloran had said. He told him what Halloran was offering. He did not get Halloran protection. He did not warn him that he was in danger. He condemned him as effectively as if he had signed the death warrant himself. On May 11, 1982, Brian Halloran left Anthony's Pier 4 restaurant on the South Boston waterfront. He had run into a friend, a man named Michael Donahue. Michael Donahue was 32 years old. He was not a criminal. He was not connected to the Winter Hill Gang or any gang. He was a truck driver, a bartender in some accounts, a working man from the neighborhood. He and Halloran were neighbors. He simply ran into Halloran at the restaurant that evening and, in an act of ordinary human kindness that would cost him everything, offered to give his neighbor a ride home. Kevin Weeks was watching the restaurant on Bulger's orders. He was on a walkie-talkie. When Halloran and Donahue walked out to the parking lot and got into Donahue's grandfather's blue Datsun, Weeks spoke the signal into the radio. The balloon is in the air. Bulger had prepared himself. He was wearing a wig, a floppy mustache, a disguise. He was driving a souped-up 1975 Chevy Malibu. He pulled up alongside Donahue's car, called out to Halloran, and then he started shooting. The guns were military-grade. The volley was sustained and terrible. Michael Donahue was shot in the head and killed instantly. He never had a chance. He had done nothing. He was a man who had offered a neighbor a ride home, and he was killed for that kindness because he happened to be in the car. Brian Halloran was shot approximately 20 times. He stumbled out of the car, somehow still alive. Bulger performed a U-turn. He came back. Kevin Weeks later testified that Bulger just kept shooting, that Halloran's body was bouncing off the ground from the impacts. Halloran died in the hospital. From blood loss hours later, after the shooting, Bulger and Weeks returned to the scene. Police were already there. The neighborhood was chaos. Weeks walked through the crowd, calm as anyone, and collected a hubcap that had fallen from the Malibu. Then, according to his own testimony, they went to get something to eat because he was hungry. Michael Donahue was survived by his wife Patricia and 3 sons. The youngest was 8 years old when his father was murdered. That boy, Thomas Donahue, would grow up to become one of the most persistent and eloquent advocates for the families of Bulger's victims. A man who spent decades demanding accountability and never stopped. His father deserved that. Michael Donahue, who gave a man a ride home, deserved that. John Callahan was next. Callahan was the front man who had connected the Winter Hill Gang to World G. Ally, with Wheeler dead and Halloran dead. Federal investigators were now looking at the World G. Ally connection very carefully. They were going to want to talk to John Callahan. Bulger and Flemmy discussed this situation with the directness of men making a business decision. Callahan would be questioned. Under questioning, Callahan might talk. Callahan needed to not talk. In August of 1982, John Callahan was called down to Miami. He went, believing or perhaps not believing, perhaps knowing and being unable to see a way out, that this was a meeting. John Martirano was there, and Martirano shot him in the back of the head. Callahan's body was found in the trunk of a Cadillac at Miami International Airport. One by one, person by person. The list grew. Arthur Bucky Barrett, 1983. A jewel thief and bank robber with detailed knowledge of certain of Bulger's operations. Barrett was brought to a house. He was chained to a chair, Bulger, in a procedure that would be used on several victims. Interrogated him, demanded to know where his money was hidden, what he had told people, what the authorities knew. Barrett told him. Bulger got what he needed from Barrett. Then he shot him in the head. Bulger would later use Barrett's fate as a tool of intimidation. When other people needed to understand the consequences of cooperation, he would say, simply, "You remember what happened to Bucky Barrett, John McIntyre?" 1984. A fisherman from Quincy, Massachusetts. McIntyre had made the mistake of becoming involved, peripherally, in the same gun-running operation that connected Bulger to the IRA, a shipment of weapons that had been intercepted. McIntyre was questioned by authorities. He cooperated. Word got back to Bulger. McIntyre was brought to a house, chained to a chair, interrogated. Bulger wanted to know everything McIntyre had told the investigators. McIntyre, to his credit, told the truth. He had told them everything he knew, which was damaging. Bulger shot him in the head. And then there were the women. Of all the murders in the catalog of Whitey Bulger's crimes, the ones that require the most care and the most gravity are the murders of two women, whose deaths were particularly intimate in their horror. Their names are Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey. Deborah Davis was 26 years old in 1981. She was Stephen Flemy's girlfriend. They had been together for years. She was, by accounts of people who knew her, a young woman of ordinary beauty and ordinary dreams, in an extraordinarily dangerous situation that she may or may not have fully understood. At some point, Deborah Davis decided she wanted to leave Flemmy. She had met another man. She wanted a different life. This, under ordinary circumstances, is a decision a woman makes and lives with. Under the circumstances of being the girlfriend of a man like Stephen Flemmy, it was something else. The problem, from Bulger and Flemmy's perspective, was what she knew. Deborah Davis knew that Flemmy was an FBI informant. She knew about the relationship with Connolly. She knew things that, in the wrong hands, could unravel everything they had built. She had been close enough to Flemmy for long enough to have absorbed dangerous knowledge by simple proximity. She was strangled. Flemmy, in court testimony decades later, said that Bulger killed her, that he strangled her while Flemmy watched. Flemmy said that he believed Deborah Davis was killed because she knew too much about the FBI connection, and that Bulger made the decision and carried it out. Flemmy then extracted her teeth. He did this to prevent identification of the body, which was buried in a location that investigators would not find for years. Deborah Hussey was Flemmy's stepdaughter, the daughter of his longtime live-in girlfriend, Marion Hussey. Flemmy had been in Marion Hussey's life since Deborah was a child. What happened between Flemmy and Deborah Hussey, the nature of the relationship that developed as she grew up, was something that emerged in court testimony with a horror that silenced the room. Flemmy had been sexually abusing Deborah Hussey since she was a teenager. By the mid-1980s, Deborah Hussey was a young woman with a serious drug problem, and she was unstable in ways that Flemmy and Bulger considered threatening. She was using her knowledge of who they were, of their criminal activities, their FBI connections, as leverage in various situations. She was dropping names when she got into trouble. She was becoming, in the calculus of their world, a liability. In 1985, Deborah Hussey was strangled. Flemmy testified at Bulger's 2013 trial that Bulger killed her, that he strangled her in the basement of a house in South Boston. Flemmy again removed her teeth. Her body was buried in a location that was not discovered for years, alongside other victims who had been similarly disposed of. The jury at Bulger's trial convicted him in Deborah Hussey's murder. He was acquitted in Deborah Davis's death. The details of these murders, the intimacy of them, the domestic horror of them, the way they blended the violence of the organized crime world into the most private spaces of women's lives are among the most disturbing in the entire record. These were not the dramatic public killings of rival gangsters in parking lots. These were private murders in basements and hidden places. of women whose primary crime was proximity to dangerous men. They deserve to be named. Deborah Davis, Deborah Hussey, they were real people. They had families who spent years not knowing what had happened to them, who spent years in the uncertainty that is sometimes worse than the knowing. They were 26, and somewhere in her mid-20s. They deserved the ordinary lives they were denied. And the men who killed them served the interests of an organization that the United States government was, at the exact same moment, actively protecting. That is the fact that sits at the center of this story like a stone. The FBI knew who Bulger was. They knew what he was doing. They knew people were dying, and they kept the protection in place. There is a chapter of the Whitey Bulger story that is less well known than the murders and the mortars. FBI corruption, a chapter that requires some historical context to understand, and that reveals something important about how Bulger moved through the political life of his community. In 1974, a federal judge named W. Arthur Garrity issued a ruling that would tear the city of Boston apart. The ruling mandated the desegregation of Boston's public schools through busing. Black students from Roxbury and Dorchester would be bused to schools in South Boston. White students from South Boston would be bused to schools in black neighborhoods. The goal was the constitutionally required desegregation of a school system that had maintained de facto segregation for decades. The method was this: put children on buses, send them to different neighborhoods, and let the law do what private agreement would not. Southie exploded. The reaction in South Boston was violent, sustained, and deeply ugly. Parents threw rocks at buses carrying black children. There were riots in the streets. The National Guard was called. Children were terrified. The hatred on display, raw, visceral, ugly, became one of the defining images of 1970s Boston and one of the more painful chapters in the city's history. Jimmy Bulger publicly opposed busing. This was not a difficult position to take in South Boston in 1974. Opposition to busing was nearly universal in the neighborhood, cutting across every other division of class and politics. People who agreed on nothing else agreed on this. And Bulger's public opposition, his visible presence in anti-busing circles, his rhetoric about the neighborhood, the community, the Irish identity of Southie, boosted his image as a man who spoke for the people. But Bulger's actual relationship to the busing crisis was more complex and more cynical than his public posture suggested. He was not, at his core, a man of ideology. He was a man of power. And the busing crisis, whatever else it was a period of extraordinary civic disruption in South Boston. A period when the official institutions of the city, the courts, the school system, the mayor's office, were locked in open conflict with the neighborhood. When the police were occupied with controlling riots. When the D and state investigators were distracted by the general chaos. Disruption of this kind is, for a criminal organization with deep roots in a community, something close to an opportunity. Law enforcement attention was elsewhere. The community was in a state of high emotion that made nuanced questions about organized crime seem secondary. And the identification of Bulger as a defender of the neighborhood, a man who stood with Southie against the federal courts, gave him a political credibility and a public goodwill that made it even harder for investigators to build community support for investigations against him. He was also doing something he had always done, making power work for him. The politicians who opposed busing in Boston needed community support. They needed to be seen as representatives of neighborhoods like Southie. Bulger's tacit endorsement, his presence, his connections, his ability to deliver a certain kind of street-level political reality was worth something to those politicians. And those politicians, in turn, were worth something to Bulger. His brother Billy was at the center of Massachusetts Democratic politics throughout this period. Billy Bulger, state senator, brilliant and careful. was one of the most powerful politicians in Boston. He had built his career on exactly the same Southie foundation that Jimmy had exploited in different ways. The two brothers never publicly discussed each other's activities, maintained a careful public distance, and yet moved through the same world in ways that made strict separation implausible. The busing crisis eventually subsided, not because the underlying tensions were resolved, but because cities develop a kind of exhausted accommodation. The schools integrated. Slowly and imperfectly, South Boston changed. Slowly and imperfectly. The rage moved underground or redirected itself. And Jimmy Bulger walked away from the crisis with his community standing enhanced. The man of Southie, the defender of the neighborhood, while the bodies continued to accumulate in the basements and under the bridges. Every empire eventually encounters the moment when the machinery begins to fail. For Jimmy Bulger, the process was slow. It was nearly invisible for most of its duration, and it was being driven, ironically, by the very success of the corruption that had protected him, because the protection was so complete that it had made him careless, and because other people were watching from outside the circle of that protection. The Massachusetts State Police and the D had been circling Bulger's operation since the late 1980s. And here is the critical detail. They were operating deliberately outside the FBI because they didn't trust the FBI. This is a remarkable thing to say about a law enforcement relationship in the United States. But the investigators who built the case against Bulger have been explicit about it in interviews and court testimony. They knew, or strongly suspected, that the Boston FBI field office was compromised. They didn't know the full extent of it, but they knew enough to understand that any intelligence they shared with the Bureau about Bulger had a tendency to disappear in ways that were not easily explained by bureaucratic inefficiency. So they worked around the FBI. They ran their own surveillance. They built their own cases. They used resources and techniques that didn't require FBI cooperation. They were patient because they understood that impatience would get people killed. In 1989 and 1990, the D ran an intensive surveillance operation targeting Bulger's drug networks, the 3 separate distribution rings he controlled in South Boston. The surveillance was sophisticated enough to document the operation in considerable detail. But bringing charges against Bulger directly proved difficult, in part because the men who actually handled the street-level dealing were not inclined to cooperate with investigators. Bulger's organization was built, in part, on the absolute certainty among its members that cooperation with law enforcement was a death sentence. The D crackdown effectively shut down the drug operation, but it did not produce the criminal charges that would have justified an arrest inside the Winter Hill Gang. Meanwhile, the atmosphere was changing. Kevin Weeks, Bulger's most trusted lieutenant, was beginning to understand that the walls were moving. He saw the surveillance. He understood that the state police and the D were getting closer. He watched Bulger's paranoia, never fully suppressed, become something more constant and visible. The meetings on Castle Island, in the open air, where recording devices couldn't easily function, became a regular occurrence. Bulger's movements became less predictable. He varied his routes. He changed his patterns. A new FBI agent named Robert Fitzpatrick, who served as Assistant Special Agent in Charge in Boston from 1981 to 1986, had tried to challenge the Bulger-informant relationship from the inside. He brought his concerns to supervisors. He recommended that Bulger's informant status be revoked. His recommendations were ignored. He was managed out. His efforts, the efforts of a man who had looked at the situation and understood it correctly, were defeated by the very corruption he was trying to expose. Outside prosecutors were beginning to look at the Boston FBI office as a problem rather than a resource. The investigations that should have been happening weren't happening. The cases that should have been built weren't being built. Something was wrong, and increasingly, People with the authority to investigate that wrongness were beginning to circle the question. Connolly, in this period, was showing the strain. He was a man who had built his career on a foundation that was rotting from within. His close associates within the Bureau had always been useful to him. Now some of them were becoming nervous. John Morris, his supervisor, the man who had taken Bulger's money and looked away, had begun to worry in private about what would happen when the truth came out. And Bulger himself, this is important, Bulger knew. He always knew. He had built his survival on the principle of knowing things before others knew them, of seeing the shape of situation before it fully materialized. He didn't know the specific timeline. He didn't know exactly who was building what case, or how close they were. But he knew that the geography of his protection was shrinking. He knew that the safety that had held for 20 years was, somewhere, beginning to leak. He made preparations. He stockpiled cash. He built relationships, outside contacts, false identities, the infrastructure of disappearance. He thought about what would be required if the moment came when he needed to simply not be there anymore. He was 64 years old. He had been the boss of South Boston for 20 years. He had killed people. He had built an empire. He had bribed FBI agents and corrupted the federal law enforcement apparatus of the most powerful government on earth. And now, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something was coming for him. The question was not whether it would arrive. The question was whether it would arrive before he could move. December 23, 1994, 2 days before Christmas, Boston cold. The streets carrying the particular melancholy of a holiday in a city that has never fully resolved its relationship with joy. Shoppers on the streets, children already dreaming of the morning after tomorrow. A city going about the ordinary rituals of the season. In the offices of the United States Attorney for the District of Massachusetts, the final pieces of a federal indictment were falling into place. It was a RICO, a racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations charge, the most comprehensive weapon in the federal prosecutor's arsenal. It named James Bulger, Stephen Fleming, a string of associates. The charges were extensive. The evidence was substantial. The indictment was days away from being handed down. John Connolly knew, he had learned, through whatever channel was still available to him, that the indictment was coming. And on the evening of December 23, 1994, Jimmy Bulger received a phone call. The details of that communication have been described in various ways over the years. A call, a meeting, a message through an intermediary. What is established is the essential fact. Bulger was warned. He was told the indictment was coming. He was given the one thing that made the difference between being arrested and being free. He was given one night. Imagine that night. You are 65 years old. You have ruled South Boston for 20 years. You have walked these streets every day of your life, known every face, owned every corner. Your neighborhood, the neighborhood your family moved into when you were 8 years old, the neighborhood that made you, the neighborhood that you made in return, is the only world you have ever truly known. Your mother lived here and died here. Your brother walks these streets. The graves of your people are in this city. And now you have one night to decide whether to stay or to go. He called Catherine Grieg. He packed a bag, a careful bag. Not the panicked collection of a man running in fear, but the deliberate preparation of a man who had thought about this moment. He had money. He had identification, false identification, carefully prepared, accumulated over years of quiet preparation. He had the resources of a man who had been thinking about disappearance for longer than anyone knew. He had also, in the weeks before this night, been spending time with Teresa Stanley, the woman who had been his companion for years. He initially took her with him when he left. They drove away from South Boston on December 23, 1994, into the American night, heading away from the city that had shaped everything he was. The FBI arrived the next day to arrest a ghost. Agents went to his apartment. It was empty. They went to places where he was known to be. He wasn't there. They checked with contacts. Sources, informants, nothing. James Joseph Bulger Jr. had walked out of South Boston between one day and the next, and he had simply ceased to exist in any way that left a trail. Back in the neighborhood, there was a quiet that was different from ordinary quiet. The people of South Boston who had known, in various degrees, what Jimmy Bulger was, they absorbed the news of his disappearance with the particular silence of people who understand that some doors, once closed, don't open again. Kevin Weeks, who knew more than almost anyone, continued to manage things as best he could. Flemmy was arrested in January 1995. He had not been warned, or had not moved fast enough, and began the long journey toward the courtroom that would eventually produce his damaging testimony. Bulger, meanwhile, was driving. He took Teresa Stanley across the country, across the world. They traveled through Europe, living out of suitcases, using false identities. But Teresa Stanley had children. She had roots. She had a life in South Boston that could not simply be abandoned after several weeks. She told Bulger she wanted to go home. She couldn't do it. She couldn't leave her children. He drove her back to Boston. She got out of the car. They said whatever they said, and he drove away, this time with Catherine Grieg. Catherine Grieg was a different kind of person. She was younger than Teresa Stanley. She was a dental hygienist from the neighborhood, educated, competent, a woman with a life of her own. She also had a twin sister, a family, a career, a future that did not involve running from the federal law. None of it mattered. She chose Bulger. She got in the car. They drove west. And they disappeared. 16 years of silence followed. They ended up in Santa Monica, California. This is, when you think about it, almost absurdly on the nose. Santa Monica, the sunlit edge of the American continent, where the Pacific Ocean stretches away toward an unimaginable horizon, where the weather is endlessly beautiful, where the streets are wide and the mood is light, and the entire culture operates on the principle that the past is something you leave behind. They rented an apartment in a 3-story building on 3rd Street, apartment 303. They paid in cash. They told the building manager their names were Charles and Carol Gosco, retirees, a quiet old couple who kept to themselves, who paid their rent on time, who caused no trouble. The apartment was small, rent-controlled, 2 bedrooms. The building was ordinary, the kind of modest apartment complex that exists in the tens of thousands across Southern California. Populated by people of modest means living modest lives. The Goscos fit in completely. Nobody looked twice at the white-haired old man and his devoted companion. Jimmy Bulger was 65 when they arrived. He was 72 when they were caught. He lived in that apartment, in various configurations of paranoia and routine. For the better part of 16 years, he was not idle. He was not defeated. He kept the habits of his former life in the ways he could maintain them. He exercised. He read voraciously history, true crime, military strategy. He stockpiled. Inside the walls of apartment 303, hidden in panels and cavities that he had carefully modified over the years, were 30 firearms, knives, ammunition, and $822,000 in cash, bundled and secured against any emergency. He had not become soft. He had not become philosophical. He had not achieved any of the resigned peace that might be expected of an old man living quietly by the ocean. He had simply transferred his operations from South Boston to a small apartment in California, scaled everything down, and waited. Catherine Grieg was extraordinary. That is the word that keeps appearing in any honest account of this period. Extraordinary in her devotion. Extraordinary in her sacrifice. She had given up everything. Her twin sister, her parents, her career, her identity, her name, her entire life, reduced to Carol Gusco of Santa Monica, California, the companion of an old man who was wanted for 19 murders. She colored her hair. She wore different makeup. She accompanied Bulger on the walks he took along the beach, along the Santa Monica Pier. Through the neighborhood, she was, by all accounts, vigilant, watching for faces she recognized, watching for anything that suggested surveillance, watching with the constant low-level alertness of a woman who understands that one moment of inattention could end everything. Back in Boston, the FBI's formal pursuit of Bulger was, in certain periods, less aggressive than it appeared from the outside. This was noticed. Critics observed that for a man supposedly at the very top of the FBI's most wanted list, placed at number 2 behind Osama bin Laden at one point, a fact that should have guaranteed the most intensive possible pursuit, the actual investigation seemed curiously lacking in urgency. In 1999, Bulger was officially added to the FBI 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list. A $1 million reward was offered for information leading to his arrest. His face was on posters. His case was featured on crime programs. His name was kept in the public consciousness through periodic news stories and documentary features. There were sightings. An off-duty Boston police officer thought he saw Bulger in San Diego after a screening of Martin Scorsese's film, The Departed, the movie that was inspired by Bulger's story. There were reported sightings in Europe, in South America, in various cities across the United States. Some of them were real Bulger. Investigators learned after his capture had traveled more freely than anyone realized. He and Catherine had not simply sat in their apartment for 16 years. They had taken trips. They had moved. They had maintained the particular freedom of people who have enough cash and enough false identity to move through the world without leaving a paper trail. The FBI, in 2011, changed its strategy. The insight that broke the case was this: finding Whitey Bulger was probably not going to happen through traditional law enforcement channels. But finding Catherine Gregg might. She was less known, less documented, but she had made her choice to go with him. And that choice, that act of devotion, had required her to leave behind people who might, if shown the right appeal, come forward. The FBI produced a public service announcement, a 30-second spot. It aired on daytime television in 16 cities. It showed Catherine Gregg's picture. It said the FBI was offering $100,000 for information leading to her whereabouts. It aired in cities where women watched daytime television. One of those women was a former model named Anna Bjornsdotter. She had once lived in the same Santa Monica apartment building as the Gascos. She had moved to Iceland and watching television in Iceland. She saw a face she recognized from the hallway of her old building. She picked up the phone. She called the FBI. The tip was specific. The address was specific. The building on 3rd Street in Santa Monica. The couple who called themselves Charlie and Carol Gusco. The FBI moved June 22, 2011. Santa Monica, California. The air warm, the light golden, the particular beauty of a California afternoon that has no knowledge of and no interest in the moral weight of what is about to happen. FBI agents from the Bulger Fugitive Task Force had been watching the building on 3rd Street for days after Anna Bjornsdotter's call. They confirmed the identities through various means: surveillance, careful observation, cross-referencing. There was no doubt. The old man in apartment 303, the man calling himself Charlie Gusco, was James Joseph Bulger Jr., wanted for 19 murders. On the FBI Most Wanted list for 12 years, 81 years old, white-haired, moving with the careful gait of an old man in deteriorating health. The plan for the arrest required getting him out of the apartment. Inside, they knew he had weapons, and Bulger, in any confined space with any weapon, was not a man you wanted a confrontation with. They called the building manager. The building manager was told to contact Mr. Gosco and tell him there was a problem with the lock on his storage unit in the garage. Would he mind coming down to take a look? It was, as ruses go, beautifully ordinary. The kind of small domestic inconvenience that no one thinks twice about. Bulger came down to the garage. When he walked in, the FBI was waiting. He was surrounded immediately, professionally, with the efficiency of agents who had been waiting a very long time for this moment. For a fraction of a second, there may have been a calculation, the old reflex, the old intelligence, assessing the geometry of the situation, looking for the angle. There was no angle. There was nowhere to go. He gave his name as Charlie Gasco for a moment. He maintained the fiction, the last, stubborn performance of a man who had been performing for so long that the performance had become instinct. The agent in charge, Special Agent Scott Dariola, told him they knew who he was, and Jimmy Bulger said, "You know who I am. I'm Whitey Bulger." They went upstairs. They took the apartment apart, inside the walls, inside the hidden spaces that Bulger had created over the years. They found the 30 firearms, the ammunition, the knives, the $822,000 in cash, the meticulous hoarding of a man who had been preparing for the worst for 16 years. Catherine Grieg was arrested alongside him. She did not resist. She had known, on some level, that this day would come. She had chosen to be there when it did. The photograph of James Bulger in handcuffs in a California parking garage, old, white-haired, pale and small, in the bright California sunlight, went around the world. The man who had terrorized South Boston for 20 years. The man who had bribed FBI agents and ordered murders and run one of the most protected criminal empires in American history. Standing in a parking garage in Santa Monica at 81 years old, handcuffed, finally caught. Look at that image for a moment. Hold it in your mind. This is what power looks like when it runs out of time. He was extradited to Boston to face trial. After 2 years in the Plymouth County House of Correction, waiting for proceedings to begin in June 2013, the trial of James Joseph Bulger Jr. commenced in the John Joseph Moakley United States Courthouse in South Boston. South Boston, they tried him in his own neighborhood, in a building named after a man who had represented the values the neighborhood aspired to. On the waterfront where Michael Donahue and Brian Halloran had been shot 30 years before. The geography of it was almost too precise. The trial of James Bulger began on June 12, 2013. He was 83 years old. He sat at the defense table in a federal courtroom and looked at the evidence of his life with an expression that people who were present described as cold, contemptuous, and utterly untroubled. He was charged with 32 counts: racketeering, money laundering, extortion, weapons charges, and 19 murders. 72 witnesses would take the stand over the course of 2 months. They included FBI agents, former law enforcement officials, surviving victims and their families, and most devastating, the men who had been closest to Bulger. Kevin Weeks took the stand. Weeks had cooperated with prosecutors after his own arrest in 1999. He had served 5 years in prison, and now, in the summer of 2013, he sat in the witness box and described what he had seen, what he had done, what had been done in his presence. The Halloran and Donahue murders, the bodies buried in the locations he had helped select, the workings of an organization built on violence and maintained through terror. He had been 27 years younger than Bulger when he started working for him. He had been, in many ways, as close to Bulger as anyone outside his family. He had been trusted with secrets that most people never hear. He looked at Bulger across the courtroom and told all of them. John Martirano had already cooperated. Martirano, the hitman who had carried out some of the gang's most distant operations. Roger Wheeler in Tulsa, John Callahan in Miami, had confessed to more than 20 murders. His cooperation was the act that had broken open the case in the late 1990s, establishing definitively the Bulger FBI connection and identifying Bulger as the man responsible for ordering the killings. Stephen Flemmi testified. Flemmi was serving a life sentence of his own. He had nothing left to protect except, perhaps, some portion of the historical record. He took the stand and described, in clinical detail, the murders he had witnessed and participated in. He described the strangling of Deborah Davis, the strangling of Deborah Hussey. He described pulling the teeth from their bodies afterward to prevent identification. The courtroom went very quiet during this testimony. Flemmi was not a sympathetic witness. He was not asking for sympathy. He was a man describing events with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had long since ceased to experience them as extraordinary. The horror was in the ordinariness of his delivery, the way he described these acts in the same tone one might use to describe routine business meeting. Bulger's defense team attempted to manage the catastrophe. Their primary legal argument was extraordinary. Bulger claimed that he had been granted immunity for his crimes by a former federal prosecutor named Jeremiah O'Sullivan. He claimed that O'Sullivan, who had overseen the Winter Hill Gang investigations in the late 1970s, had personally promised him that he could not be prosecuted for anything he did as part of his arrangement with the FBI. Jeremiah O'Sullivan had died in 2009. He could not take the stand to confirm or deny the claim. Bulger's attorneys knew this. The defense knew it. The prosecution knew it. Everyone in the courtroom knew it. The claim was strategically constructed to point at a dead man who could not speak, to create a reasonable doubt that could not be definitively refuted. The jury found it unconvincing. Bulger also steadfastly denied that he had ever been an FBI informant. This was perhaps the most revealing aspect of his entire legal defense. Not the denial of murders, not the claims of immunity, but the insistence that he had never informed. In the world he came from, in the code he had lived by, being a murderer was something a man could live with. Being an informant was the unforgivable thing. He would claim anything, construct any alternative story, rather than accept that designation. The FBI's own files said otherwise. His informant status was documented, supported by contemporaneous records, confirmed by multiple former agents. The evidence was overwhelming. Bulger called it all lies. On August 12, 2013, after 2 months of testimony from 72 witnesses, the jury of 9 women and 3 men began deliberations. They deliberated for 5 days. On August 12th, they returned their verdict. Guilty on 31 of 32 counts, 11 murders proven. The jury convicted him of the killings of Paul McGonigal, Edward Connors, Thomas King, Richard Castucci, Roger Wheeler, Brian Halloran, Michael Donahue, John Callahan, Arthur Barrett, John McIntyre, and Deborah Hussey. They did not convict him of the murders of Deborah Davis, Michael Milano, Al Plummer, and several others, either acquitting him or failing to reach agreement. In the gallery, the families of victims who had waited decades for this moment sat and absorbed the verdict. Patricia Donahue, Michael's widow, the woman who had raised 3 sons after Whitey Bulger shot her husband for the crime of giving a neighbor a ride home, was there. Thomas Donahue, who had been 8 years old when his father died, was there. Others too, families who had spent 30 years in the particular agony of loss without accountability. The verdict did not restore what had been taken. Nothing could do that, but it said formally, on the record of the United States federal judicial system, that these things had happened, and that this man had done them, and that the pretense was finally over. On November 14, 2013, Judge Denise Casper sentenced James Joseph Bulger Jr. to 2 consecutive life terms in federal prison, plus 5 additional years. He was 83 years old. He sat in the courtroom during sentencing with the same expression he had worn throughout the trial. No remorse, no visible emotion. Whatever he felt about the verdict, and he certainly felt something, it was locked away in that interior space that no court, no prison, no jury had ever been able to reach. He was taken away to begin a sentence he would never come close to completing. John Connolly was not a villain in the way that Jimmy Bulger was a villain. Jimmy Bulger was born into a world that produced men like him, and he became exactly what that world made. He had a clarity of purpose that was terrible precisely because it was so consistent. He wanted power, and he pursued it with a ruthlessness that, from a purely strategic standpoint, was almost without flaw. John Connolly was something more complicated and, in some ways, more tragic. John Connolly grew up in the same housing project as Whitey Bulger. He was about a decade younger, young enough that Bulger was a legend to him before he was anything else. The older boy from the project who had gone to federal prison and come back harder. The man who had become, in the mythology of South Boston, something between a protector and a predator. Connolly became an FBI agent. He went to college. He was, in many ways, a success story of the Southie neighborhood that had produced both Bulger brothers. A young man of intelligence and ambition who had channeled those qualities into a legitimate career. He had a wife and a family. He was by many accounts a charming, sociable man, someone who could work a room, who people liked, but he had never left South Boston, not in the way that matters. His loyalties, formed in the housing project before he was old enough to understand what loyalty meant or what it would cost, had never been updated by his subsequent education or his professional obligations. When Connolly approached Bulger in 1975, he was not approaching a criminal target. He was approaching a figure from his own mythology, the man from the project who had become a legend. And Bulger understood this. He read Connolly with the same accuracy he read everyone. He saw what Connolly needed to be the man who had cultivated this relationship, to bask in the reflected glory of Whitey Bulger's power and sophistication, to feel that the boy from the project had become someone. Bulger gave him that. He also paid him over the 2 decades of the arrangement. Connolly received more than $235,000 from Bulger, cash. Gifts, expensive wines, he was wined and dined. He was made to feel important, valued, essential, and in exchange, he provided the information and the protection that kept Bulger free. The evidence suggests that Connolly understood, on some level, what he was doing. He understood that people were dying because of the information he provided. He understood that Brian Halloran was killed because of the tip he gave Bulger. He understood that the machinery of justice was being corrupted through his hands. And he kept going, month after month, year after year. The investigation of Connolly began in the late 1990s as the full scope of the FBI's Boston corruption became undeniable. He retired from the Bureau in 1990, seemingly having escaped the consequences of his arrangement. For a few years, it appeared he might get away with it entirely. He didn't. In 2002, John Connolly was convicted in federal court in Boston on charges of racketeering, obstruction of justice, and accepting bribes. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but the most significant reckoning was still to come. The murder of John Callahan, the World Jai Alai man, shot in the head in Miami in 1982, had resulted directly from Connolly's tip. Bulger that Callahan was about to be called before a grand jury. By warning Bulger, Connolly had set in motion the chain of events that ended in Callahan's murder. Prosecutors in Florida made the argument that this made Connolly criminally responsible for the killing. In 2008, in a Florida courtroom, John Connolly was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of John Callahan. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He was 67 years old when the Florida sentence was handed down. He is, as of this telling, still imprisoned in Florida in his 80s, serving a sentence for a murder committed in 1982 by a man he spent his career protecting. His appeals have been denied. His legal maneuvering over the years has been exhausted. The boy from South Boston, who grew up idolizing Jimmy Bulger, is ending his life in a prison cell because of that idolization. There is something in John Connolly's story that resists clean moral categorization. He was corrupt. He was functionally responsible for murders. He was a servant of the law who became the law's enemy. All of that is true, but there is also something in his story about the kind of loyalty that forms before judgment matures, the loyalty of childhood, of place, of identity, and how that loyalty, when it is not reckoned with and updated and brought into conflict with adult responsibilities, can quietly corrupt everything it touches. He made his choices. He is paying for them. The tragedy is real. It does not excuse anything. It simply makes the story more true. After the trial, after the conviction, after the sentencing, James Bulger was transferred through the federal prison system. He spent time at the Federal Correctional Institution at Butner, North Carolina, then at the Federal Correctional Complex at Colvin, Florida. He was 83, 84, 85, 86 years old. He was in a wheelchair. His health was deteriorating. He had a heart condition. He had the accumulated physical costs of a hard life, a long imprisonment, and 8 decades of existence. In the prison system, he was simultaneously feared and despised. Feared because of who he had been. The reputation traveled with him. The ghost of the man who had ruled South Boston. Despised because of what he was known to have been, an informant. In the hierarchy of prison culture, regardless of what else a man has done, there is no lower status than informant. The man who had denied being an informant in open court, who had staked his last shred of public dignity on that denial, could not escape what the record showed. By 2018, the Federal Bureau of Prisons decided to transfer him again. The official reasons involved his medical care level. The designation had been adjusted in ways that opened up different placement options. In October 2018, Bulger was moved from Coleman in Florida through the Federal Transfer Center in Oklahoma City. On October 29, 2018, he arrived at the United States Penitentiary Hazleton. Near Brewston Mills, West Virginia, USP Hazleton had a reputation. Corrections officers who worked there had been warning Congress for months about the conditions, about the chronic understaffing, about the violence, about the management failures that made it one of the most dangerous facilities in the federal system. It was the third facility in the federal system to have experienced a homicide in the 40 days preceding Bulger's arrival. 3 homicides in 40 days. In that time, corrections officers had sent urgent requests to Congress asking for intervention. Those requests had not yet produced results. This was where the Bureau of Prisons chose to house an 89-year-old man in a wheelchair who was one of the most notorious FBI informants in American history. In the general population, without any special protective measures, over 100 Bureau of Prisons personnel knew about Bulger's incoming transfer. In a facility where inmates knew everything, where the information economy of prison culture operated at remarkable speed, Bulger's arrival was announced before it happened. The inmates at Hazleton knew he was coming. Some of them were waiting. On the morning of October 30th, 2018, less than 12 hours after Bulger arrived at Hazleton, security footage captured 2 inmates rolling his wheelchair to a corner of his cell. Out of the camera's direct view, at 8:20 in the morning, a corrections officer found James Bulger unresponsive in his cell. He was 89 years old. He had been beaten to death. The weapons used were a padlock attached to a belt, swung with the full force of men who intended what they were doing. His eyes had nearly been gouged out. His tongue was nearly severed. Law enforcement officials who saw the body used the word unrecognizable. The men responsible were identified relatively quickly. Foscio's Freddie Guess, a 51-year-old former hitman for the Genovese crime family in Springfield. Massachusetts, Paul DiCologero, a Massachusetts gangster already serving a long sentence for his role in a separate, deeply disturbing murder. And Sean McKinnon, who served as lookout. Dice was a man known in criminal circles for two things: his capacity for extreme violence and his particular contempt for informants. DiCologero had told a fellow inmate before the attack that Bulger was a snitch and that they planned to kill him as soon as he arrived. They spent approximately 7 minutes in Bulger's cell. 7 minutes in September 2024. Foscio's Guess was sentenced to an additional 25 years for the voluntary manslaughter of James Bulger. He was already serving life. DiCologero received 4 additional years. McKean, who had pleaded guilty to lying to federal agents, was sentenced to time served. A Department of Justice Inspector General investigation, completed in 2022, found that Bulger's death was the result of multiple layers of management failures, widespread incompetence and flawed policies at the Bureau of Prisons. It found no evidence of deliberate orchestration by any Bureau employee. It found, instead, a system so broken, so understaffed, so negligent, that it had effectively placed an 89-year-old man in a wheelchair into the hands of men who intended to kill him. Bulger's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Justice Department. It was dismissed in 2022 on the grounds that federal law did not give them the right to sue. His headstone at a Boston cemetery bears only one word: Bulger. The man who spent a lifetime accumulating and wielding power, who had terrorized thousands, corrupted federal law enforcement, ordered the deaths of 19 people, and evaded justice for 16 years, ended his life in a West Virginia prison cell, beaten to death by men he had never met, in a facility where no one had been watching carefully enough to prevent it. He died the way he had lived, in violence, alone, away from the neighborhood that had made him. There is a question that sits at the center of the Whitey Bulger story that is easy to ask and very hard to answer. How? Not how did he kill so many people? The mechanics of that are documented in exhaustive courtroom detail. Not how did he evade capture for 16 years? That, too, has been extensively analyzed. The deeper question is this: how did the United States government allow this to happen? How did the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the institution charged with protecting American citizens from exactly the kind of predatory, organized crime that Bulger represented, become his primary shield and protector for 20 years? The investigation that followed Bulger's capture, and the trials and investigations that accompanied it, produced answers that were simultaneously specific and terrifying. The specific answer was John Connolly and John Morris, and a supervisory culture within the Boston FBI field office that valued informant relationships above everything else, above accountability, above oversight, above the lives of the people those informants were killing. Connolly was the primary conduit. Morris was the corrupt supervisor who enabled it. A handful of others played supporting roles. These were specific men who made specific corrupt choices over a specific period of time. But the terrifying answer was broader. The system that was supposed to prevent this, the supervisory oversight, the auditing of informant relationships, the accountability mechanisms, the external checks had failed completely. Not through a single catastrophic failure, but through dozens of small ones. Rules that were technically on paper, but not enforced in practice. Documentation requirements that were observed formally, but circumvented substantively. Supervisors who chose not to look because the results they were seeing. Mafia prosecutions. Successful informant cultivations made them look good. The FB I's Boston field office scandal produced substantial reforms within the Bureau. Changes to how informants are managed, new oversight protocols, new requirements for documentation and supervision, new rules about the involvement of FBI supervisors who have personal connections to the communities they police. These reforms were real. They were necessary. Whether they were sufficient is a question that only time and future failures will answer. The families of the victims never received the full justice they deserved. Criminal convictions of Bulger, of Connolly, of Flemmi, of Martirano and Weeks and others were obtained. Civil lawsuits produced some financial settlements. Though these were later complicated by appeals, the Donahue family, whose case was one of the most straightforward instances of government liability the FBI had, through Connolly, directly caused Michael Donahue's death, won a multi-million-dollar judgment that was subsequently overturned on appeal due to filing deadlines. The families of Roger Wheeler in Tulsa, the family of John Callahan, the families of the women in the basement, Deborah Davis, Deborah Hussey, the families of the men whose names appeared on the indictment, people who had spent decades not knowing what had happened to their loved ones, who had then learned not only what happened, but that the government had known, had protected the killer, and had done nothing South Boston. Over the years since Bulger's capture and trial has undergone its own reckoning. The neighborhood has changed, gentrified, diversified, its old insularity eroded by the economic forces that have reshaped every urban neighborhood in America. The world that made Whitey Bulger no longer exists in the form it took in the 1930s and 1940s. The housing projects where he grew up have been transformed. The taverns where deals were made are gone or converted. The tight, suspicious, fiercely loyal Irish Catholic enclave that was Southie has become something looser, more varied, more expensive, and the community has had to reckon, in ways it found deeply uncomfortable, with what it meant that this man had been, for 20 years, a figure of genuine affection and respect, that mothers had pointed him out to their children as a protector, that families had been grateful for the Thanksgiving turkeys, that a neighborhood that prided itself on its toughness and its self-reliance had not looked too carefully at what was funding the generosity, or what was happening in the basements of the buildings a few blocks away. The 2015 film Black Mass, with Johnny Depp playing Bulger, brought the story to a new international audience. It was a well-made film that captured certain elements of the man and the era with considerable accuracy. The controlled menace, the FBI corruption, the neighborhood dynamics. Depp's performance was widely praised, but as people who knew the full record were quick to point out, the real story was darker. The film, for all its grimness, did not fully convey the industrial efficiency of the violence, the extent of the drug dealing that Bulger publicly denied, or the full horror of what happened to the women. Catherine Grieg was sentenced to 8 years in prison in June 2012. Having pleaded guilty to conspiracy to harbor a fugitive, conspiracy to commit identity fraud, and identity fraud, she served her sentence. She has never, by any account, said a word against Bulger or expressed anything other than loyalty to a man who ordered murders while she gave up her entire life to be beside him. Her loyalty is one of the stranger human mysteries embedded in this story. What binds a person that completely? What does a man like James Bulger offer that could justify the sacrifice of everything? The psychology of it resists easy analysis. What is clear is that for Catherine Grieg, the bond was real and absolute. Whatever we think about the choices she made, the devotion itself was authentic. She was not naive. She knew who he was. She chose him anyway. Billy Bulger, William Bulger, the senator, the university president, the respectable pillar of Massachusetts Democratic politics, lived through his brother's trial and conviction with a public dignity that was, by any measure, extraordinary. He had maintained throughout his career A careful public silence about his brother's activities. He had refused to cooperate fully with congressional investigations into Whitey's whereabouts during the fugitive years. Refusal had produced significant political controversy and ultimately contributed to his resignation from the presidency of the University of Massachusetts. He attended his brother's funeral in November 2018. The two brothers, who had grown up in the same housing project, who had taken the most divergent paths imaginable, were bound to each other by blood until the end. And at the center of everything, there remains the question that haunted this story from the beginning and will haunt it as long as it is told. What does it mean when a democracy's own law enforcement becomes the criminal's bodyguard? The answer that Connolly and Morris and the corrupted Boston FBI office provided was specific and damning. It meant that 19 people died who might not have died. It meant that $30 million in drug money flowed through a neighborhood while its protector publicly condemned drugs. It meant that women were strangled and buried, and their families were left for years without answers, while the FBI's files contained information that might have prevented it. But the question points beyond this specific corruption to something larger. It points to what happens when institutions lose sight of their fundamental purpose, when the measurement of success becomes something other than justice, when the people who are supposed to be protecting others begin protecting themselves and their relationships and their careers instead. The FBI Boston field office was not uniquely evil. It was not populated by men who woke up every morning and decided to do harm. It was populated by men who made small compromises over long periods of time, who told themselves stories about the greater good, about the bigger picture, about how the Mafia prosecutions justified the arrangement, until they had compromised so completely that they could no longer see the distance between where they were and where they had started. This is how institutions corrode, not through a single dramatic act of betrayal, through hundreds of small ones. James Bulger is gone. His empire is a memory, documented in court records and books and films, and this long, dark story, South Boston has moved on, as cities do. The people who loved him have had to reckon with what they loved. The people who feared him have had to live with the fact that their fear was entirely rational. The FBI has its reforms. The courts have their records. The families have their grief, and on a blank headstone in a Boston cemetery, there is just one word, Bulger, no dates, no sentiment, no explanation. Just the name of a man who spent his life accumulating power and who left behind nothing but a hole. We've come to the end. If you made it here, all the way here, through all of it, then you are one of the real ones. You understand what it means to sit with a story until it's finished, to follow it through the darkness until the light comes, or doesn't come, or comes in the wrong direction. I want to thank you, genuinely, sincerely, the trust you give when you choose a story and stay with it. That's not nothing. That means something. We traveled tonight from a housing project in South Boston in 1938 to a parking garage in Santa Monica in 2011. From a blonde-haired 8-year-old boy watching the world with eyes that missed nothing to an 81-year-old man in handcuffs in the California sun. From the fog rolling off the harbor in the dead of a Boston winter to a prison cell in West Virginia at 8:20 in the morning. We heard 19 names that deserved to be heard. We saw how power is built and how it eventually always exhausts itself. I want to ask you something before you go to sleep. Drop a comment. What part of Whitey's story shocked you most? Was it the FBI? Was it the women? Was it the 16 years in Santa Monica, living 2 miles from the ocean under a borrowed name? Was it the verdict? Was it the end? Tell me. I'll read every single one. If this story meant something to you tonight, if it kept you company, gave you something to think about, stirred something that doesn't quiet down easily, please share it. Send it to someone who loves true crime, someone who can handle the dark. Hit subscribe if you want more nights like this one. Stories told the way stories should be told, slowly, carefully, with the weight they deserve. Next time, we go somewhere even darker. There is a man so dangerous, so difficult to categorize, so far outside the ordinary boundaries of criminal biography, that the government itself wasn't sure what to do with him. A story that makes this one look almost simple. Rest easy tonight, if you can. There's fog rolling off the harbor somewhere. There's a street going quiet. And somewhere in the silence between one breath and the next, the ghost of a city's worst-kept secret drifts past, pale and cold, and is gone. Sleep well.